Hey guys, we're about to jump into our passage and talk a little more about what it means to choose faith over fear. But first, I have a really fun announcement. We are coming back in person to church this Sunday. Now, there won't be any students or kid activities, but you can feel free to come to the worship center. We've sent out some information about kind of what that's going to look like and what that's going to require from you. But I'm really excited to maybe see some of you on Sunday. We're really excited about that. Also, we have a top three. This week's top three is, what are the top three foods you would want to eat at a summer cookout? I'm all about the meat, so I want some ribs, some burgers, and maybe some sausage, Lots of good stuff. But let's get into our passage together and learn a little more about what it means to choose faith over fear. Welcome to another week of Calvary Students. It's been so awesome to continue to meet together and talk about how we can choose faith over the fear that's in our lives. Every single story that's really awesome, I think has some moments of risk, some moments of danger, some moments where the main character has to take the leap. And we've talked about that a few times in the stories that we've looked at so far. One example is like the story of Noah. Noah builds this massive boat, and he and his family get on it, and there's been no rain at all. What if whenever Noah got on the boat, there was just a light drizzle? It would kind of seem like it was worthless for him to have gotten on the boat. But instead, a flood comes, and so there was real risk. If Noah didn't actually step through in faith, he would have been swept away in the water. That's how stories of real faith happen. Someone has to take a risk. Someone has to make the choice, even though there may be consequences that are negative. And so today we continue. Last week we looked at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we talked about how they chose faith, even though the king was going to come after them and throw them into a furnace. And they said, you know what? Even if God doesn't save me, He's still good, and we're still going to follow Him. Well, today we pick up in Daniel chapter 6, and we're going to look at how Daniel, the main character of this book, chose to have faith in a really difficult circumstance. In the moments where they're tough, God shines through the brightest. God works in amazing ways whenever His children choose to follow Him, even in their toughest moments. So we're going to see that through Daniel chapter 6. So let's read together. I'm going to start in verse number 6, and then I'm going to introduce you to who Daniel is. Daniel 6, verse number 6 says, "So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said to him, 'May King Darius live forever.' All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den." They were all about throwing people into things if they weren't going to worship God. Last week we had the furnace. This week we had the lion's den. If they weren't going to worship the king, they're getting thrown into something. And I don't know which one you'd rather, be thrown into the furnace or the lion's den. I'd rather neither, honestly. And so they say, if you don't bow down and worship the king, if you worship any other god during this time, then you're going to get thrown into a den of lions. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable. It means it can't be changed and cannot be changed. So King Darius signed the written edict. All right, so we've talked about Daniel a little bit and who he is. So Daniel is a stranger in the land of Babylon, but God's been with him. He's been doing amazing things and trusting God. And so King Darius, the king of Babylon, has put Daniel over a lot of people because he's very trustworthy. He's a very reliable guy. And these other guys that are maybe from Babylon, they don't like Daniel because he's not from where they are. And they think that he's got his position unjustly. And so they try to go after Daniel. And so what they do is they hatch this little plan of jealousy where they go to the king and say, "Hey, king, you're amazing. Man, you know what we think? We think that for this amount of time that everybody should worship you and not the gods that they've been worshiping. And if they do worship another god, we're taking them out. We're going to make sure that they worship you and not a man, not a god. And so we're going to throw them into the lion's den." Well, Daniel had been following God all this time in Babylon. He had faced many circumstances where he could have chosen his fear over his faith, but instead he was faithful to God. Daniel in this passage had to choose faith or fear. He was given the option to follow God and lose his life, or bow to King Darius and lose his faith and turn his back on God who had been faithful to him for all that time. And there are moments in each of our lives where we maybe don't have a choice this extreme, but we have choices whether we're going to follow God or we're going to follow people, whether we're going to maybe give up popularity and still follow God, or we're going to go along with the crowd just so that everybody else will like us. We're going to see in this passage that Daniel picked faith over his fear, and God did some amazing things because he chose to do that. So let's keep going. Let's read in verse number 10. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. What do you think he'll do? What do you think goes through Daniel's mind? He hears, I must bow down to King Darius, or they're going to throw me into the lion's den. Daniel has this moment of crisis where he has to choose, what am I going to do? The windows in his upstairs room opened towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to God, just as he had done before. So Daniel had been praying day after day after day, week after week after week, month after month after month, year after year after year. He had this habit of praying to God, and he thought about it and thought about maybe praying to Darius or praying to God, and he said, you know what? God's been faithful to me in the past. He won't stop being faithful to me now. I'm going to continue to pray to God. So this window is open, and Daniel is praying to God, and then we see what happens. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. Daniel's in this moment of prayer, and these guys come and they find him praying to God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person that petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, as a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable. So they were sneaky. They came to the king and they said, hey, king, I thought you said that everybody's got to worship you and not their own gods. And the king said, oh yeah, I definitely said that. And then you know what they did? They said, oh, well, we just saw Daniel, and I'm pretty sure he was not worshiping you and he was worshiping another god. He was praying to another god. And so they go to get Daniel in trouble. And we see in verse 16 what happens. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him in the lion's den. Man, that escalated really quickly. I mean, the edict goes out, these guys go and find Daniel, and Daniel is now in the lion's den. And this is what the king said to Daniel as he throws him in. The king said to Daniel, may your God, who you continually serve, rescue you. The king didn't really want to throw him in the lion's den. He was just caught in a really tough spot. But even still, Daniel is in the lion's den. Daniel in that moment could have turned his back on his faith. He could have turned his back on God. He could have gone away from all the things that he had been doing. But instead, Daniel, in this verses we see, held on to his faith. Daniel made the right choices even though the consequences were deadly. And there are moments in our life where it's really hard to know what's going on, where we have questions and doubts for God. And in those moments, what's important is that we hold on to God, not thinking that we have all the answers, not having everything figured out, being okay with the questions, and just holding on for dear life. And Daniel was doing that. And I think that shows us that Daniel knew that God was worth risking his life being thrown in that lion's den. And because of that, we can choose to follow God regardless of the consequences that may come to us. But now we're going to see what happened to Daniel. Daniel, he prayed, he got thrown into the lion's den. Now what's going to happen to Daniel? So the king goes and he wants to see what happens. So we're going to continue reading in verse number 19. Here's what it said. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. So the king wasn't playing around. He wasn't waiting till late in the day. The king, as soon as he got up, he runs, he hurries to the lion's den. And when he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, the king said, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? And you got to think from the king's perspective, that moment where he's waiting to see if Daniel says anything probably feels like an eternity. I mean, the king knows in his heart, like, nobody can survive the lion's den. There are lions in there. There's no way that Daniel is alive. Then Daniel spoke with the king. May the king live forever. Wow. Daniel still had respect for the king, even though he just threw him in the lion's den. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him, and also before you, your majesty. I have not done any harm. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed because he trusted in his God. And so Daniel spends the night with lions, which sounds really, really crazy. But an angel came and shut their mouths and did not allow them to hurt Daniel in any way because God protected him. God knew that he hadn't done anything wrong against the king, against him. And so God protected him in a really cool way. And then we see this verse. It's really cool. Verse 26 and then verse 27. It says, I issue a decree, Darius is saying this, that to all my royal dominion, people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Don't miss this. So Daniel, he's faithful to God. And through that, Darius, this king who's really wicked and honestly doesn't follow God in any way, he sees through this whole situation that Daniel's being for real, that his God is true. His God had been faithful to him all that time. And Darius writes up something to all the land that God is the true God, and he talks about him in amazing ways. He talks about how God rescues, how God delivers. Man, Daniel knew that. He had been rescued by God. He performs signs and wonders. He had done all these amazing things. And so Darius, this king that didn't even know God, is praising him and sending out his name to the nations. And so the last thing we see in this passage is that God saved Daniel as a witness to the world. We see first, Daniel had to choose faith over fear. Second, Daniel held on to his faith even when it got hard. And third, God saved Daniel as a witness to the world. Because Daniel was faithful to God, lots of people learned about how great God is from the mouth of an evil king. I mean, God did something amazing. Because Daniel didn't follow the crowd, God was glorified to lots of people. You know, in our lives, we kind of have to think about this because God has told us to share his name to everyone. God wants your faith to be a witness to the world. I want you to think about something. A man with a disease, he has no hope, no vaccine, no way. He goes to a doctor and he asks the doctor to do something. And so the doctor begins working and working and working. And this is a disease that many people have. But this man gets the doctor to work on a vaccine. And one day, finally, he gets a call from the doctor. And the doctor says, hey, I have great news. I have a vaccine for this disease that so many people have, but you've gotten me to work on it. I have a vaccine. I'm going to come over right now. I'm going to give it to you. The man is overjoyed. He's so excited because before he was going to die, and now he has this vaccine that's going to save his life. So the doctor comes over. He gives him the vaccine. What do you think the right response is going to be of the man who's gotten the vaccine? Well, there are a lot of people in the world that have this disease. What would you say if that man said, you know what? All right, I'm good. I'm so thankful to you, doctor, for saving my life. And now what I want to do is I want to take the stores of vaccine that maybe are left. I want you to just keep them, or I want to keep them to myself because, man, this is so good for me. What would you think about that guy? I mean, I think you would think he was pretty selfish because he has the vaccine for a disease that would help so many people. We would expect for him and that doctor to give it to as many people as they can to help them. But so many times, because we have fear and we don't have faith, we don't share God's love to other people. Our life isn't a witness to who God is. When we have the way to eternal life, we have the way to be forgiven of sins. We have the way to be adopted into the family of God. When we choose faith over fear, God gives us an opportunity to share our faith with others through our life. And so I ask you, are you holding on to the gospel? Are you keeping it to yourself? You're saying, man, this is great for me. I love the fact that I'm going to heaven when I die. I'm going to keep that to myself. Or are you sharing that with other people? Our big idea today is that God uses our faith to bring others to Him. You know, in that moment, like Daniel could have just been like, man, God, thank you so much that you saved me from the lions. Now I'm going to continue doing my thing. But instead, a nation learned about how great God is because Daniel was willing to stand against the crowd and share about God and live for Him. And so my response step for you today is identify the fears you have in sharing your faith. Identify the fears that are stopping your life from being a witness to God. And I want to ask you a few questions, things for you to think about this week and as you look in small group. First, who's a person right now you could be praying for that doesn't know Jesus? There are so many people in our lives that probably don't know Jesus. Who's somebody that you can begin praying for and asking God, God, please give me an opportunity to share my faith. God, please save this person. The second question, how could you start the conversation about what it looks like to follow Jesus? I want you to think about that. What could you begin that with? How could you share your story with them? And lastly, what do you want God to do in the life of your friends who don't know Jesus? Do you want them to be saved? You want them to be adopted into God's family? I hope that you do. I hope that this week you've been able to see that when we have faith and we don't let fear control us, so many more people can learn about God. And so my challenge to you is that as you continue throughout the summer, even though we're socially distanced, even though we're apart, that you'll find ways through your faith to share with other people and introduce them to what God's done in your life. This week, I hope you're challenged to continue to share your faith, to continue to gather with other students, and to continue to learn more about God. Small group is an important part of that. If you haven't jumped into Zoom groups, man, I'd challenge you to look in the description of this video and sign up tonight because it's going to be a great time. We have fun, we talk about fun questions, and we really dig deep into what it means to follow Jesus. I hope you're doing well. Can't wait to see you in person, and we'll talk to you later.